Welcome to Chapter 2, Forging a New Government, the Constitution. We will be talking about colonial history, the Revolutionary War a little bit, and a pretty extensive timeline from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. Looking at some of the weaknesses of the Articles, what happened during the Constitutional Convention, and within the process of ratification between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and a little bit about the Bill of Rights. So let's begin with some colonial background. Jamestown was the first permanent English colony in America. They instituted a representative assembly, which was a legislature made up of individuals who represented the population. And this would actually be the precedent set for other colonists of how to structure governance and leadership. And as we probably know from middle school and all of those Thanksgiving pageants, in 1620 we have the Mayflower coming over, right? Establishing a colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They had signed the Mayflower Compact, setting up their power and government structure. And their Mayflower Compact is actually a lot like the social contract that we've been talking about, right? People signed it and they agreed to create and submit to the authority of the government, right? It was a mutual agreement based on consent. And like the Representative Assembly in Jamestown, they also set the precedent for similar compacts in American history. However, not everything set a benchmark for the U.S. The Plymouth colony was religious, and the founding fathers of the Constitution, actually had a different vision for the state and religion, with a separation between them. But we will talk more about that in Chapter 4 when we talk about civil liberties. So other colonies flourished throughout the years, and by 1732, the last of the 13 original colonies were established. And technically, London governed the colonies, but the colonies also had their own limited governments, which were under British Crown charters, since they were so far away from England. The colonists could also make their own laws, which also foreshadowed our modern Constitution and Bill of Rights. As we probably remember again from middle school or maybe a high school class, the issue that started the conflicts between the colonists and Britain was the raising of taxes of the colonies, right? Britain was protecting them during the French and Indian War and expected the colonists to help pay with the costs. The colonists, on the other side, having enjoyed some independence, saw it differently, that Britain was now trying to get more control, especially economic power over them. And so there's these series of acts imposed by Britain that increased taxes on the colonists, and the colonists in turn boycotted English commodities. And they got so sick of the taxes that in 1767, the colonists dumped 350 chests of British tea into the Boston Harbor in a gesture of protest, right? The Boston Tea Party, as it's known. And Britain responds by closing down the harbor and putting Massachusetts under direct control. Of course, the colonists are outraged and they hold a Continental Congress, the first of two, and they try to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now? There really isn't much talk of independence yet, and they send a petition to King George III telling him about their grievances. And unsurprisingly, Great Britain does not respond too well. Still, by the Second Continental Congress, there isn't much talk of independence. They're still trying to reach a peaceful settlement with the British Parliament, which I think is a little bit interesting. But eventually, the people saw that there's no other recourse. They have to become independent. The role of economics was important in the Declaration of Independence from Britain. The Second Continental Congress in 1776 voted that the American colonies would have free trade with all countries except Britain. And so this was actually already an implicit Declaration of Independence. And then by July, it was official. They had the official Declaration of Independence. And they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. That's a section of the Declaration of Independence. Looking a little bit deeper, just to highlight some stuff we've been talking about, what is the social contract again? Right, the mutual agreement between individuals and their government. So where do we see the language of the social contract within this section of the Declaration of Independence? I'll give you a second to look that over. I have it bolded there, at least one word. We have the word consent, right? So they're talking about these rights, right? That they're derived from their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? So the power of the government comes from the consent of the people. And even if the government ever becomes destructive of these ends, right? If they no longer hold up their end of the bargain, it's actually the right of the people to change the government or even abolish it. All part of the social contract, right? What else do we see here? Well, all men are created equal. Of course, this was a revolutionary document, but there are some significant problems here. And what are these problems? Well, pretty intuitively, you see the word men, right? So you don't see women and you don't see people of color, even though it does say all men here. All men in the Declaration of Independence was not a generic term for human beings like you might see in some texts. Politically, the revolution was actually a step back for women. It was after the war that they were specifically prohibited from voting. And as we know, it wouldn't be until 1920 that women had the right to vote, sometime later. Women did participate in the Revolutionary War effort, though. They boycotted British goods, they sewed necessary materials, they did a lot of nursing work, they housed soldiers, and they also collected money to help the Continental Army. Some of them even met up to discuss political matters, and they organized pretty extensively. But still, they were not included. As Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams, I cannot say I think you very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives, right? So she paralleled the power that Britain has over the colonies with the power that men or the husbands have over their wives. All men in the Declaration of Independence also did not include African Americans or any other people of color. Most colonists did not see all people as created equal, right? The slave trade continued until 1807. So like Frederick Douglass wrote, I cannot speak today, this 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Written several years later, of course, but that sentiment is very much true. Both in 1852 as well as in 1776. Like Abraham Lincoln summarized here, the assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain, and it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for future use. So it wasn't until a lot later, right, that the Declaration of Independence was an accurate declaration for all people. And arguably a lot later, considering the realities of women and minorities. So we have the Revolutionary War continuing until 1781, until General Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. And in 1783, Britain officially recognizes the independence of the U.S. in the Treaty of Paris. The first form of government in these newly independent states of America was based on the Articles of Confederation, and this was officially ratified in 1781. And this framework established the rules for the new government. The Articles of Confederation were our first constitution, and they showed the state's desire for autonomy, right? Think about the historical context. The states just won their independence from a huge national power, right? Britain. The last thing they wanted to do was create another large national power. So they set up a system that had a very weak central government, right? And they were also really wary of one another. There wasn't a lot of trust between the states at this point, and they didn't want one state to gain power above the rest. So because they feared the development of this huge, powerful central government, their interest was in making a confederation. And what does that mean? What is a confederation? Well, by definition, it's a voluntary association of independent states. So these states agreed to only a very limited restraint on their freedom of action, right? So this creates a very weak central government, right? Because the states maintain almost all of their sovereignty and their power. In a confederation, each state is sovereign, and the central government really only has the job of running the collective business of the state. So the federal government has no independent source of power and resources for its operations. And we can see some of these conflicting powers. I think Table 2.1 in your book has a more extensive list. I just wanted to highlight some of them. So this is what Congress could do, and this is what Congress could not do. So, for instance, Congress could enter into international treaties and alliances, right? This is a power that they had, but they could not compel states to respect these treaties. On the other side, Congress could declare war. They could establish and control the armed forces, but they couldn't actually draft the soldiers, and they couldn't actually get the states to pay for any of it. Congress had the power to regulate coinage, but on the other side, it could not regulate interstate commerce or foreign commerce. Each state actually could tax imports from other states. And Congress also could not issue paper money, which means this was actually left up to the states. So each state had like a different currency, and they actually differed pretty greatly in terms of purchasing power. So the Virginia dollar actually might have been worth, it might be worth $1 in Virginia, but it's worth a lot less, let's say, in Massachusetts. So this is very disorganized, and it doesn't actually prove to be a very strengthening kind of thing, right? It's actually very chaotic. Other issues under the Articles. Any amendments required unanimous consent of the Congress and confirmation by each state legislature. You can imagine that's pretty hard to do. Try to think about any kind of group activity you've ever done or group project, right? It's really hard to get a consensus on anything. There's also no national system of courts. The functioning of the government under the Articles of Confederation is basically dependent on the goodwill of the states. And it was what the book calls a league of friendship, right? It's not really a national government. And it became less of a friendship and more like a rivalry by 1784. Because of these weaknesses, these inherent weaknesses in the Articles, the central government couldn't really do too much to maintain peace and order. The states bickered, they taxed each other's stuff, caused some pretty serious economic downturns, and as your book explains, when the banks were making people pay back their loans and people were being thrown into debtors' prisons, people had enough. And in 1786, led by a guy named Daniel Shays, mobs of gun-wielding farmers seized a courthouse that was trying to try people with all their debt and attacked a federal arsenal. They were stopped, but the rebellion showed that this government, under the Articles of Confederation, was really not adequately structured to provide for people's welfare, and something must be done. So it's obvious changes needed to be made, right, to the Articles of Confederation. Things were not working as is. And in 1787, as you see here, a convention was held to talk about the problems, right, the relationships between the states and the federal government, issues about a national legislature, the need for an executive, right, because we actually don't have like a formal president at this point, and some establishment of economic policies. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was what was called a unicameral legislature. Uni meaning one, right? Um, and this unicameral legislature was made up of ambassadors from each state. Each state had one vote, right? And some of the states, especially the bigger ones with way more population, didn't actually really like this too much. So, in terms of trying to figure out the issues and fix the issues of representation, there was two ideas, right? So first you have the Virginia plan. And Virginia put forth this idea of a bicameral legislature or two-chamber legislature, right? Bi means two. And the representatives would be proportional to the state's population. So the bigger the state, the more representatives it would have in the legislature, right? So what do you guys think? Is this a fair plan? Well, what do you notice about Virginia compared to a lot of these other small states? Pretty huge, right? Well, Virginia is bigger, right? And it wanted to ensure that the bigger states, like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, had more of a say in the legislature and more power, right? So Virginia is leading this charge for this system and for a stronger government overall. So the smaller states saw that they would have a lot less of a say in the Virginia proposal. So you have New Jersey also proposing an idea, but a different one. The articles would be pretty much unchanged when it came to the one state, one vote rule. So equal representation in the legislature, no matter how big your state is, right? So New York would get one vote, Pennsylvania gets one vote, New Jersey gets one vote, Delaware gets one vote, right? One state, one vote, no matter how big your state is. And so this would give the smaller states a more equal voice, right? So of course, unsurprisingly, a lot of the smaller states liked this idea. So there was a ton of debate, and even some of the smaller states threatened to leave the convention because they were so scared that they would end up with a situation that would be terrible for them. So they decided to have a compromise, right? So there would actually be a bicameral, right, or two-chamber legislature, the lower house being the House of Representatives, which is based on population, right? And the other chamber in the legislature would be the Senate, and it would be just based on the fact that you're a state. You have two representatives no matter what, right? So we have this two cameral system, right? The House of Representatives based on population, which is what Virginia wanted, and the Senate, which is based on what New Jersey wanted, more of an equalized vote. So literally every state has two senators no matter what. There was another compromise made, and this is in reference to counting slaves in terms of the state's representation. Slavery was legal in the North, but it was concentrated in the South, and there was delegates that wanted slavery to be banned. They were opposed to it, but then there was this really strong Southern opposition to any ban. So one of the main issues of contention, besides the fact that humanity, right, was enslaved, there was enslaved people, but this other issue in terms of representation was how to count slaves in terms of the population of a state, right? Since having a bigger population meant more representation in the House, the North and the South were split, right? Since, as we know, let's go back for a second, right? The House of Representatives is based on population. So if you were counting slaves, your population would be increased, right? And you actually might get more people in the House of Representatives. So, of course, the Northerners did not want the slaves to be counted, and the South did, right? Because they had a lot of slaves. So you had this compromise made, and it's called the 3/5 compromise. They met in the literal middle, nearly the middle, and decided that slaves would count for 3/5 of a person in terms of counting the population of a state. The question of slavery was obviously not really adequately addressed at this time. The delegates decided that Congress couldn't ban the importation of slaves until 1808, so there's this 20 years of unrestricted slave trade, and the requirement that slaves who escaped had to be returned to their owners. And even though there were people who were against slavery, they were too nervous that the South would abandon the convention if they tried to outlaw it. So unfortunately, like Madison, they thought that the Union breaking up was actually worse than slavery, so they made this, I guess, another compromise, you could call it, to maintain the issues as they were, to maintain slavery and its legality moving forward. So let's talk about the separation of powers, what is called the Madisonian model. As we know from last chapter, the delegates were always really worried about the fact that a tyranny could form, that a majority could form and rule against the minority. So Madison actually suggested the idea of a separation of powers. What does this mean? This is the most descriptive element of American government, the separation of the three branches of government between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. That is what we mean by the separation of powers. And since there is this separation, there's no one branch that has enough power to dominate the others. So all three are independent, but they do cooperate to govern. And these are what is called checks and balances, right? Each branch checks the power of the other. So we have this handy-dandy image here. For instance, the president can appoint Supreme Court justices with the consent of the Senate, and the Supreme Court has the power to declare acts of the president unconstitutional. Or another example, the legislature can pass laws, but the court can also declare a law unconstitutional. So the judicial branch checks the power of Congress, right? And then the president can also veto a law, right? So the Congress could pass a law, and it goes to the executive branch, and President Obama, for example, can be like, nope, veto. But then the legislative branch could also override a veto with a 2/3 vote, right? Another example, the president nominates Supreme Court justices, and the Senate has to confirm, right? They can confirm or deny the nominations. And Congress can also impeach judges, right? So you have this sort of give and take between the three branches that checks the power of each. Of course, there are ways around this. It's not a perfect system, and you can manipulate it. For example, Congress controls money, right? They control the purse strings of government. So if Congress disagrees with the president's program, it could actually refuse to appropriate the funds, right? Or the president can also wait until Congress is in recess to do what's called a recess appointment of a judge, and then it doesn't have to be confirmed. But these are not super common; they're a bit rare, and you do lose political points when you kind of go under the radar like this. So you don't really see this a ton, but it is possible. So back to the Constitutional Convention. There were still things that the delegates disagreed about. The two opposite factions appeared in this battle over ratification, or what is called, what is also called formal adoption, right? And you have this divide between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. And what actually ensued were a series of 85 anonymous essays written in newspapers. You might have heard of these, pretty famous. And they were actually, so they were anonymous back then, but they're actually written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And these are the famous writings called the Federalist Papers. So the Federalists on the one side supported the ratification of the Constitution. They wanted a strong central government. They wanted a strong federal government, right? That's why they're called Federalists. They wanted the federal government to regulate interstate issues and concerns, have the power to tax, which, as we remember, Congress couldn't have. They didn't have it under the Articles. They basically wanted to correct the weaknesses of the Articles. They wanted the government to be able to borrow money, to coin money, do all this stuff, right? They wanted the Constitution to create a strong union. And the Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were not so wild about a strong federal government, and they opposed it, actually, in its existing form, right? They were anti-federal government, anti-strong federal government. And they saw it as giving a lot of power to the federal government, but really no protections or legal guarantees of the rights of the people, right, living under the Constitution. They were really nervous about the abuse of power, and they thought, well, if we can keep government small, then it would be a lot easier to control. Well, the Anti-Federalists ultimately won the battle, but we do have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, which was another sort of compromise between the Confederates, Lord, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? So we do have a strong central government, right? But the Anti-Federalists wanted the Bill of Rights, and that is what was adopted. So here is a sort of really, really truncated version of the Bill of Rights. You have the freedom of religion, press, assembly, and petition the government. The right to bear arms is the Second Amendment. You don't have to house soldiers if you don't want to, right? There are rules for arrests and searches, right? You can't have double jeopardy. You can plead the Fifth. There's other trial rights for the Sixth. Seventh is the right to trial by jury, right? Number 8 is there's no cruel and unusual punishment or no excessive crimes or bail. The ninth, here we go, right here, clarifies that any individual rights that are not stated in the Constitution does not mean that that these can be used by the federal government to increase its power, right? So the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in its entirety is not exhaustive. We don't have every single right in the Constitution. So the 10th kind of follows up on that. Well, if it's not clearly stated in the Constitution, it doesn't go to the federal government, but rather it goes to the states and the people. So even if there might not be something written explicitly in the Constitution, we assume that it goes to the powers, that we assume it goes to the people or the states, if it's not directly given to the federal government. We'll learn more about these in detail in Chapter 4. I just wanted to give you kind of a highlight of what was actually ratified as well. So as a quick recap here, right, this is the before and after. So in the Articles of Confederation, we have a pretty strong state system, right? So the states retain sovereignty. Afterwards, in the Constitution, the people are sovereign. During the Articles of Confederation, state law was supreme. Now, the national law is supreme, right? The Supremacy Clause. Any law that's in conflict with federal law, right? So there is a state law that conflicts with federal law. Well, that is not okay. The federal law is actually supreme. We had a unicameral legislature before. Now, of course, we have this bicameral legislature, right? Equal votes in the Senate. Every state has 2 senators. And then within the House of Representatives, representation is based on the state's population, which every 10 years is checked by the census, right? So we maintain very accurate count. There was some other changes made. Go ahead and read through these in your book, and I will stop here. I'm sure you're so excited to go and do your quiz. As always, any questions, please let me know, and I'll leave you until Chapter 3.